What happened in the 1970s that changed the face of rock music? Today I'm talking about progressive rock. I'll be talking about bands like Pink Floyd, Genesis, and so many more. Let's start with the birth of prog music. It's hard to pinpoint where it all began, but for the purposes of this video, let's say it began when bands took jazz and classical influences and combined them with rock music. Two bands that were doing this were King Crimson and Gentle Giant. These bands frequently composed long, elaborate songs with multiple sections. They called them movements, similar to what was done with classical music. It went beyond the typical verse-chorus-verse structure of pop songs. One example of this is King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man. Then there were the jazz influences. Jazz often employs complex rhythms and irregular time signatures. Both King Crimson and Gentle Giant are known for using signature changes. For example, there's one song on Reflection by Gentle Giant from their album Freehand from 1975. The song features frequent changes between time signatures like 4/4, 3/4, 7/4, and 6/4, and others, often within very short phrases. These songs were not easy to play, so for that reason, many of the musicians in these bands possessed a lot of talent. For example, Robert Fripp from King Crimson, he was a very unique and influential guitarist. Robert Fripp developed a highly distinctive style. He used some crazy terms like Frippertronics, which was a tape loop system, and later used what was called New Standard Tuning, which showcased his experimental approach. His playing combined precision, complex arpeggios, and aggressive, often avant-garde improvisation. Then there was John Wetton, the bass player of King Crimson. He later went on to play in Asia, so it's fair to say that he played his bass guitar in the heat of the moment. According to Robert Fripp, he provided a flying brick wall of power and precision. He could deliver driving heavy lines with also navigating complex time signatures. However, prog wasn't just long songs with complex arrangements. These albums often told stories. Sometimes the stories were all connected within one album. I'm talking about the concept album. One of the first examples, and possibly the first concept album, is the Moody Blues Days of Future Past from 1967. The album is sometimes called orchestral pop, other times called proto-prog. It's an album that tells a story taking place in a single day. It includes the song Nights in White Satin. Then there was Tommy by The Who. Now before you comment, I know The Who is not a prog band, but we can say this album is at least prog adjacent as it tells a story, and it is a rock opera. It tells the story of a deaf, dumb, and blind boy. The album has lots of great songs, such as Pinball Wizard. Finally, there's Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick, an album that just has one song that spans both sides of a record. The album is kind of a satire of prog bands, but this is one of their best prog albums, even though Jethro Tull was a band that incorporated a lot of different genres in their sound. Even though the album is just one song, it was divided into smaller songs, such as the song called Really Don't Mind. These albums that told the story became popular in the early 1970s. Progressive rock was moving into the mainstream. I'm talking about Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd and Selling England by the Pound by Genesis. While prog had a strong following, Dark Side of the Moon catapulted Pink Floyd into global superstardom on a scale previously unimaginable by the genre. It proved that complex, conceptual, and experimental music could achieve massive commercial success. Unlike some of the more esoteric prog albums, Dark Side managed to balance its progressive elements with strong melodies, relatable themes, and a cohesive flow. This made it accessible to a much wider audience than the typical prog. While Selling England by the Pound is widely considered a masterpiece within progressive rocks and the fan favorite, its impact on the mainstream was more nuanced and less immediate than Dark Side of the Moon. The album solidified Genesis's reputation as a highly artistic and innovative progressive rock band. It was a critical success and performed well within the UK, but despite this, Selling England did contain some of Genesis' more accessible and melodic moments for the prog era, notably the single I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe. Became their first top UK 30 hit in the UK. This track demonstrated that even a highly complex band could craft a catchy, radio-friendly song. This popularity in prog rock led to more festivals. Rock festivals like the Isle of Wight Festival and Knebworth played a crucial role in showcasing and solidifying the popularity of progressive rock, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. These large-scale events provided a massive platform for bands to reach huge audiences and demonstrated the genre's growing appeal. The popularity of Isle of Wight festivals, mostly in 1969 and 1970, were pivotal, and the 1970 festival in particular is often referred to as Prog's Woodstock by some. The 1970 festival was particularly significant for many prog acts. For instance, Emerson, Lake and Palmer played their first public gig there, making an immediate and impactful impression with their virtuosic, bombastic performance of songs like Pictures at an Exhibition. I'll talk more about Emerson, Lake and Palmer a little later, but first let's talk about the other festival. Knebworth House in Hertfordshire, England, became a legendary venue for large-scale rock concerts starting in 1974. While it hosted a wide variety of rock genres, progressive rock had a strong presence there, mostly in the early years. As prog rock matured through the mid-70s, Knebworth provided a consistent large-scale venue for bands that already were popular, such as Pink Floyd, who headlined in 1975, and they showed off their post-Dark Side of the Moon stadium presence and really showed their status as being one of the biggest bands in the world, which was a band deeply rooted in progressive rock. With all this prog out there, eventually members came and went. They joined bands, they left bands, and they formed the supergroup. I'm talking about Emerson, Lake and Palmer. They were immediately recognized as a supergroup when they formed in 1970. Their members had already been in popular bands, so let's talk about them. First, we had Keith Emerson on keyboards. He came from The Nice, which was this highly influential band known for their progressive rock sound. Emerson's keyboard playing was very popular, and he used this classical approach, and he also had a jazz influence. And he was already a well-established and respected musician. Then it was Greg Lake on vocals, bass, and guitar. He was a founding member and vocalist and bassist for King Crimson. He had a melodic vocal style, really great bass playing, and he was really crucial to King Crimson's early success. He was also the producer for Emerson, Lake and Palmer's first 5 albums. And we have Carl Palmer on drums. He made a name for himself as the drummer for Atomic Rooster and another band called The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. And his drumming was already recognized for his skill and inventiveness. It was around this time that the term supergroup was being thrown around. Emerson, Lake and Palmer really fit the definition. They were a bunch of musicians who were already stars, but they already had that ready-made fan base and high expectations. So when Keith Emerson met Greg Lake, they toured together in late 1969, and they realized they had this chemistry. That's why they decided to form this new group, and then they were able to perform at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, where they played their first gig. That really showed off their technical sound and how great of a band that they were. Now, progressive rock was becoming more popular, so it started to bleed into or influence other genres, such as heavy metal and punk rock, which doesn't really sound like they fit. Well, for metal maybe, but not really for punk, so let's talk about that. We have early metal bands like Black Sabbath, who weren't really considered prog rock, but their songs did have some influences. So, for example, there were some longer song structures, and we had these multi-part epics, like we had Genesis' Supper's Ready, which were really long songs. So metal bands started to write longer songs. I think a good example of this would be Iron Maiden's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Progressive rock used lots of odd time signatures and polyrhythms, and that found its way into metal when there were bands that were using these types of things. A good example would be Dream Theater and the song Octavarium. Prog's emphasis on instrumental prowess set a high bar for musicianship. Metal guitarists, drummers, and bassists aimed for similar levels of technical mastery, pushing their instruments to new limits. A good example of this is John Petrucci of Dream Theater. And concept albums also told stories. They put together these long narratives, and they just had these really great philosophical and fantastic lyrical themes. And a good example of this would be Queensryche's Operation Mindful. Proto-metal with progressive structures and musicianship, which were kind of bridges from progressive rock to heavy metal. Probably the most obvious and influential example would be early Rush, even though they were influenced by Led Zeppelin, but they evolved to incorporate these complex songs. So they had albums like 2112, A Farewell to Kings, Hemispheres. They had these long compositions, intricate arrangements, and virtuosic playing, which was especially Neil Peart's drumming, who was really influential on other metal bands. One band you wouldn't really think would be influenced by progressive rock would be Black Sabbath, who I mentioned before. They were known for heavy riffs, but they had a few albums in the mid-70s or early to mid-70s, like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath and Sabotage, had more complex arrangements, acoustic passages, experimental elements, and that hinted at some progressive rock influence. There was Queen, their theatricality, multi-layered vocals, and complex song structures, like Bohemian Rhapsody, had this clear progressive rock influence, and they became a global hard rock and pop phenomenon. Finally, there is punk rock. This is where the relationship is more paradoxical. It's often framed as rejection rather than a direct influence. However, even in rejection, there is a form of influence. While their methods were very different, both prog and punk shared a desire to break free from conventional pop song structures and commercial restraints in their respective eras. Prog broke them by adding complexity. Punk broke them by stripping everything back. Despite the public animosity, some punk and post-punk musicians quietly admired or were influenced by certain aspects of prog. The idea of challenging norms and experimenting with sound, even if in different directions, was common to both. Many early punk and new wave musicians came from art school backgrounds, similar to many prog musicians. The shared foundation fostered a willingness to engage with avant-garde ideas. Punk rockers like John Lydon or Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols openly said that they were fans of progressive artists like Peter Hamill, of Van der Graaf Generator, and krautrock bands like Can and Hawkwind, which had these psychedelic, space rock, and often proto-punk elements. As punk evolved into post-punk, the influence became more apparent. Post-punk bands often reintroduced elements of complexity, experimentation, and atmospheric textures, sometimes reminiscent of prog's adventurous spirit, but filtered through a new punk or new wave aesthetic. Bands like Magazines showed a willingness to explore more intricate song structures and moods. And even The Clash, mostly on their album Sandinista, they branched into this very eclectic and experimental territory. So that's the history of progressive rock in the early 60s and 70s. Of course, there's a lot more going on, but that's what I want to talk about in this brief 10 to 15 minute video. So in the meantime, check out this video right here for more progressive rock. Give the video a like. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe if you have not already. I do rock and metal reviews, rankings, and more. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.